you. Sorry, just closing my own door. So it is a pleasure to be here. And for those of you that tuned in right on time, you'll know that I'm a little bit on the back foot with this. I actually got my times wrong. So I was expecting this to be a preparation call where I was going to say, well, how many people will we be working with? What kind of style do you want me to work with? Shall we use breakout rooms? So in true emergent fashion, it's now up to you guys to help decide. I know how many people are on the call. My assumption, I think, is that I have a piece of thinking to share with you, and it has effectively 7 components to it. And my suggestion is that I pause after each component, and we perhaps there's a sort of underpinning question about what's resonating for you, and what are you noticing you have quite a strong reaction to. Because what I was hoping to do with this community is really to socialize my thinking and to see whether or not it fits with your own understanding of what coaching supervision is. So maybe that could be my first question, a kind of structure where I share with you a piece of my thinking, and then I invite you to just tell me how you're reacting that piece of thinking. Does that sound like an okay way forward for the group? I'm seeing some thumbs up and some nodding, so that's good.
And I would invite people to use the chat room as well as verbally.
Oh, that's a great idea. Yeah, and can you keep an eye on that for me, Lenny, because I know it's quite difficult when you're in flow to kind of multitask in that way. So let me see if I can share my my screen. So can you see a slide come up? Sure. As you can see, for me, I was expecting to do this on the 19th. So note to self, get a bit more organized. Anyway, what I thought I would do is just invite you to think personally. I'm imagining everybody on the call is a practicing supervisor. So cast your own back to how you felt about the shift between operating as a coach and then operating as a supervisor. And then I'd like to share with you the 7 principles that guide my work as I work as a supervisor. And as you can see, they're listed there. And then should we have any time at the end, we can have a bit of more of an open Q&A. So let's start with you just reminding yourself. Can you remember, and I'm just asking you to do this as a reflective activity, how you felt moving from practicing as a coach to practicing as a coach supervisor? Maybe remembering those early practice clients or those first few clients where you had to work out who you were going to be as you supervised. I'm just going to give you a moment to recall whatever you can about those individuals, maybe the place that you were in, maybe your sense of self as you began to navigate a new pathway. And what I'm offering here is, if we think about metaphor in terms of how we work and perhaps what needs to shift, this is a kind of sense of what was shifting for me. So I think when I was working as a coach, I was taking that kind of helicopter view and trying to be very neutral, trying to make sure I'm mobilizing the resources within them, but really not getting too involved in the story. And I particularly love this this sort of optical illusion picture, because it helps me think about what I do when I supervise. And almost every time I look at it, I'm kind of drawn to different elements in it. And if I share this with other people, what they notice is often different to what I notice. And in fact, the more I share it with people, the more different things people see in it. And I think that's kind of how I am when I'm supervising. It's a kind of I'm much more involved. I'm much more of a collaborative endeavor. And guess what? My supervisees tell me or help me learn things. It's not absolutely a one-way street of facilitating their learning. Whilst they're the focal point for the discussion, I almost always come away learning stuff myself. So maybe just pause there for a moment and just hearing what other people's senses of what is the difference that makes the difference between their coaching and their supervision work, and maybe just hearing from a couple of people how they would describe their shift. So Lily, I can't see everybody at the same time. So if anybody's offering to speak, if I could ask you to manage that for me, that would be great.
Well, maybe we can just take the slide down for this couple of minutes and you'll see everyone. There you go.
Good idea.
I would say I'm not the most experienced supervisor yet, far from 20 or 15 or 12 years or whatever you'll own, Michelle, as accurate. But it's funny because I felt the opposite way. I felt like I'm less involved in the story when I'm a supervisor, if the story is between the coach and their client. Mm-hmm. I'm much more focused on to use your metaphors, the near ground of the coach themselves and what's happening for them, and of course possibly what's happening for us. But I felt like the helicopter applied a little more to my supervision experience, if that makes sense.
That's interesting, isn't it? And one of the things I truly believe that each of us add value in our own peculiar way, so how something is for one person will work really well, and another person needs to work differently and authentically, and it will be equally as useful. One more perspective perhaps before we move on.
Josette, go ahead.
Mm-hmm.
So in supervision, similar to Lillian, I see myself in the cockpit as the co-pilot. We've used that metaphor a lot in what we're working on now. And so I have to bring myself, I'm in the cockpit with the supervisee and what's going on in that cockpit, where when I'm the coach, I feel like I'm more the air traffic controller. They want to fly somewhere, and I'm helping them get to that destination where they want to go. So I feel like I'm out a little bit more outside the helicopter as a coach.
Yeah, interesting. I'm loving all the aviation metaphors. Fantastic. Let's move on, because I'm conscious in an hour that will disappear quickly in front of us. So let's go back to the presentation. So the thinking that I'm offering is based out of some work that Peter Bluckett did back in 2006, where he articulated 7 principles of working as a coach. And effectively what I've done is extrapolated from those principles to think about what might be different when we're working as a supervisor. And these are the principles that are guiding me. So that his first principle is about, in coaching, going from telling to asking. And that was certainly a memory from my point of view. I'd worked in HR for many years. I was in an organization. I was paid to have an opinion. So when I was learning how to coach, the first thing I had to do was kind of learn how not to tell. And if I extrapolate that, I think that as a supervisor, I have a bit more license, not necessarily to tell, but to offer. And for me, the role of supervisor is kind of multifaceted. And there are certainly times when a kind of mentoring frame might come in. Maybe if we're working in a developmental space and people are stuck for techniques, I might offer. But it's always offered, always done for me as a gift, in the sense that they don't necessarily have to accept it. They might want to take it back to the shop and return it and get a refund. you know, it's put out there lightly for them to take if it's helpful, and to allow me to hold on to it if it's not. So as you can see, I have got some reflective questions there, but I think in given where we are today, it would just be useful to again just pause and see how people feel about this notion about feeling perhaps a bit more free to offer some of themselves, some of their experience when they're a supervisor, more so than when they're a coach. So I'm seeing a couple of nods there. Dede's nodding, and she's on mute. Michelle's come off mute.
Yeah,
Hi.
my own metaphor between a coach and a supervisor, it's like two cooks discussing recipes, or two surgeons discussing what they do. I mean, so the notion of that we are sharing the same knowledge, and so the gift, in my opinion, is when I have discovered something as a supervisor, I can give that as a gift to the coach sometimes.
Lovely, thank you.
Yes,
And
and I
Dede?
found even in my own personal experience, it was when the coaching supervisor offered their perspective, which in many ways validated my own when I might have had many doubts. It doesn't mean it was right, but there was a rapport there that I didn't feel when someone was not in that mindset with me, was not sharing that concern or challenge with me. Does that make sense?
So they were walking side by side with you, it sounds.
Right.
Yeah, yeah,
And,
lovely.
yeah, that gave me also more permission to doubt that, in a way, to be able to question that, but also to feel less alone.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'd echo that. There's certainly something about partnering with a supervisee. Okay, let's move on. So the second principle from Blucker is about unleashing potential, and I guess this is where, you know, as a coach, we try to work with people that have potential that we can tap into. We tend to move away from working with remedial cases, not always, but it's very much about what can be, what possibilities there are. And the picture there is about, you know, having big shoes to step into. And certainly many of my coaching clients are on a journey of stepping up in seniority. So I started to think about, okay, what does that look like if we put the supervision lens on? And I guess not exclusively, but when we're thinking about unleashed potential in an individual, we can very easily step into a kind of solution-focused, sort of action-oriented persona to sort of mobilize that discovery process, to kind of get them and help them maintain momentum. And if we think about that from the context of supervision, that felt wrong for me, in that actually I've realized I was much more interested in the exploring than I was in the what's going to come out at the end. So for example, if a coachee, a supervisee brings something that they're stuck with, I'm much more interested in exploring what was it that got them stuck than I am in, and what will you do next time? So my emphasis as a coach is perhaps, you know, sort of future focused and action oriented. And I've noticed that my emphasis as a supervisor is much more on the kind of what's contributing to this particular issue. And actually done well, and, you know, I have sessions that go well and I have sessions that don't go so well. But when it goes well, I'm left with a sense of what I would call resolution. So they feel different about how they're next going to go into their client situation, and they're less worried about what they'll do, because they kind of know how to be. And that's what happens when people unpick what caused the stuckness, or what caused this clunk or whatever. So once again, let's pause and hear from you.
Yeah, when I'm supervising, I really feel like I'm walking together with my supervisee in the unknown, like in an unknown land, and we're discovering it together. And I love the excitement of all the discoveries we are having together. It's really exciting.
Yes, and it sounds like it's that when something is truly original that neither they nor you knew before, but in the co-creation something new is born. Lovely.
I love the way you framed it. It's they leave the session knowing how they're going to be instead of what they're going to do, because if they know how they're going to be, the rest will unfold. So yeah, totally agree with you. Not so much focused on the outcome and actions. Thank you for framing that.
You're welcome. Good. Well, let's move on. Let's see what else we've got. So as you notice, I'm just skipping over these reflective activities. That was for a different audience. So yes, the third principle for Bluckett is about awareness and responsibility. And I think, you know, I've been in the helping professions all my life. So if any of you know the drama triangle, then, you know, the lure of being the rescuer is ever present for me. You know, it's something I'm very mindful of, and over time I'm much better at managing. And what Bluckett talks about is, you know, actually let's not take responsibility away from the individual. The job of the coaching is to leave awareness and responsibility in the lap of your coachee. It's their job. You are facilitating the process. So I keep having to remind myself on what's next. And what we're dealing with is that individual's view of the world. It's you know, undoubtedly, if you're working with an individual in an organization, there is a context to this, but your focal point, or my focal point as the coach, is the individual in front of me, helping them raise their awareness, helping them take responsibility for what only they can take responsibility. It shifts quite significantly when I'm in the supervision role. And this for me is perhaps part of what you might call the normative element of supervision, or the quality assurance element of supervision. Whenever people are bringing me something to review, I'm not only looking at what's happening for them, so, you know, kind of I4 of the 7-eyed model. I'm looking at I1 and thinking, okay, so how would that have impacted on the individual client themselves? It's almost like there's two streams of attention going on at any one time. Whereas in a coaching situation, I'm much more focused on the person in the chair, aware that they don't live in a vacuum. I almost oscillate when I'm in the supervision chair, because I'm constantly thinking, okay, what's going on for this individual in the scenario that describing, and how is that impacting on the ultimate client? And so they've only got a proportion of my energy. I'm almost looking beyond what they're describing to imagine how that's landing with their coachee. And I think for me, that's something that is, it's a tough one, in the sense that I veer away from judgment and evaluation, but it is also where I offer some crunchy challenge. So for example, I was working with somebody the other day, and they described working with the empty chair technique, and it didn't go well, which is why they were bringing it. And I asked them, you know, how did they come to choose that particular technique? And their honest answer was that they just discovered it. They'd been talking about it with some other coaches, and they thought it might be a good thing to trial. And I said, so what was it about your coachee that suggested to you they might this might work well for them, at which point the penny dropped, because it was very much on the coach's agenda to try that out, and it didn't have much at all in relation to what the client was bringing, or certainly their sense of safety to enter into that. It was seen as an experiment from the coach, and I'm imagining it probably didn't land very clearly or very safely with the client themselves. And so I brought that into the room and offered a bit of challenge, which was absolutely my reference point was their client, not them at that point. And that's what I would call guardianship. As almost when a coach comes to me, they're not the whole client, my client. I am dividing my attention between the coach and their coachee. So let me just stop there and see if there's a reaction to this notion of guardianship.
So the question comes to mind for me is, when you bring a parallel process into a supervision scenario, if that helps them to frame up how it's affecting their client, that's helpful. But are there any times when it could be really not helpful to use parallel process, or because you're just offering it, to your first point, it's okay to use that? Because that's something I've been, quote, practicing, and I don't want to fall into the same trap of, because I'm practicing it, I'm forcing it.
Sorry, I was a little distracted there with my screen. So the question is are there times when using a parallel process might not be helpful?
Mm-hmm.
The only time I would say that it's not helpful is when there's so much going on, and perhaps you've got a relatively novice coach that doesn't really understand parallel process. They're in that transactional stage of development. And I know I've done it occasionally when I thought, oh gosh, I can see a parallel between how they're being with me and how they might be being with their client. And just sort of meeting this complete glazed look, it's like, I have no idea what you're talking about. So I think there's something about supervisee readiness or coach maturity, which is as accurate as the observation might be. If they're too early in their journey, it might just serve to confuse. And then I would probably move to a much more transactional input. And I guess if I'm really in the moment and on the front foot, I might try to do something in my behavior which would role model what I'd hope they would do in their behavior. And then there's an opportunity to have a bit of a review of what did you notice about how we just managed that last part of our conversation, and seeing if it was more accessible when they're on the receiving end of it. And then we can talk about how it feels and how they might do something similar or different. So yeah, I might go through that sort of behavioral route rather than a intellectualization of exploring the parallel process.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions about this notion of guardianship, when we're not just dealing and concerned with a small c, with not just the person and how they're presenting in front of us, but what that might mean, I1 perhaps of the 7-eyed model, reaching beyond the room and imagine how the other person is impacting on their client.
Dee Dee just marked into the chat that guardianship brings up ethics conversations in her experience.
Yeah, mine too. And I actually prefer talking about guardianship than ethics. As soon as you say ethics, a lot of people close down and feel like there could be a right and wrong. But I had a wonderful piece of work the other day from Ernesto Spinelli, who's from the existentialist frame. And he was talking about the difference between seeing over work as a supervisor and overseeing. And if you're seeing over, then it has much more of an authoritarian stance. Whereas if you're overseeing, it's much more about that broader perspective.
I would say one thing that happens, Michelle, for me in the guardianship ethics area, where I can see coaches might be getting themselves into trouble with, as you say, HR or other expectations that aren't clear in the contracting. So I bring it up. But if I'm not careful, that just triggers my rescuer.
Mm-hmm.
Let me protect you because this is going to cause you a problem. You need to think about this a bit. Where are you in all of this? You know, so it doesn't mean it's easy.
Yeah.
That conversation.
And it's interesting. It's interesting because my rescuer gets directed towards the client, the ultimate client, the coachee, not my supervisee.
No, it's the other way. Well, both.
As I said, we're all different, aren't we?
Yeah, I rescue anybody.
Right, let's move on. Let's see if I can find my slides again.
And Michelle's making a point that the client system should be brought in too.
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Well, I mean, and client might be the whole string of stakeholders that sit behind or sit with the coachee. So yeah, I quite like this this phrase from Henry Ford. I'm sure you've come across it before. This is one of Blockett's principles about building self-belief in the coachee, and you know, it's that sense of perhaps almost being a cheerleader for the individual. Whether you think you can or think you can't, you're probably right. As Ford says, and I think I see it as a coach that, you know, we are in their corner and helping them think about. First of all, we believe that they've got the capacity and resources within them already, but it's really about helping them leverage that in order to move forward on their coaching goals. And actually, again, I see this quite differently when we think about supervision. And when I've taken this elsewhere, this has been the slide perhaps that has fallen with the biggest clunk. I love the notion of harnessing self-doubt. I think when people come to supervision, it's those doubts that hold rich territory for exploration. And often what people are inclined to do is, you know, they want to have a different perspective which would make it all right, that make those doubts go away. And actually, I think it's about harnessing that self-doubt. I think if we acknowledge that that doubt is probably there for a reason, then actually that gives us a wonderful focal point for what's really going on. And that might be to do with what's going on in their relationship, or it might be a more restorative piece in terms of how is this mirroring what's going on in their wider life. And so for me, the notion of embracing self-doubt seems slightly paradoxical, and I like it. I like the notion that people bring their doubts, and I think that should be something, or for me, it's something that I encourage them to harness and to travel with it rather than reduce it or put it somewhere else. Because in traveling with our doubts, we become so much more cognizant of stuff that's outside our comfort zone, or that's new, or that's causing different dynamics. If we just reassure and calm and build confidence, I think we're missing an opportunity. It's in the self-doubt that there's richness and newness to explore. So let me just pause. Any thoughts on this? So Eva's got a message here, self-doubt of the supervisor and of the supervisee. Well, absolutely, it may well provoke a parallel process. And that, again, that's one of the occasions when it might be useful to offer that, such that it draws attention to the supervisee's self-doubt. But in the main, I notice a lot of coaches bring, I'm not sure if I did the right thing there. I'm not sure what's going on. I'm not sure what we should do next. And it's not the, back to my earlier point, it's not the what we do next. It's about the, okay, so what's causing that question in you? So, any other thoughts and questions?
I would just agree. I've been having a conversation with another coach about vulnerability and what vulnerability, this is what's in my head as you're saying this, and what vulnerability brings as a gift with it and how you can use it. And that's similar but different, because self-doubt is showing where are my soft spots, like where are the parts where I haven't quite thought it through, or I'm not comfortable, or I'm not self-confident for whatever reason.
Yeah, no, I think vulnerability's right in there. It causes us to be vulnerable when we doubt ourselves. So Michelle's offered us something. I can't quite read the whole of it. Lily, can you read the whole of it? We have a joke here. It starts.
Some coaches are trying to become the world champion of humility. Nice one.
Yeah.
Who's winning, Michelle?
Don't know. Who do you think?
I doubt it's me.
Yeah, I guess for me it comes back to authenticity. So any kind of over-engineered facet will come through as being false, really. So humility is useful, vulnerability is useful, but if we overplay it, then it becomes something else. So it comes back to authenticity, about expressing that which is true and real, rather than distorted because we're putting a kind of expected lens on it. So let's see what we've got next. Yeah, so going back to Bluckert, when he talks about his coaching principles, his book is about executive coaching. So he reminds us that we need to work in a business context. There'll be multiple stakeholders. There might be external influences that ripple through into the coaching agenda. And he talks about, you know, involving not just the sponsor or the line manager, but sometimes the coachees, observers, so other people in their system, in order to get a full picture of the work. And I was wondering how that might apply to coaching supervision. And I suspect this is changing as we talk. So I've noticed, certainly I said, Lily said, how long have you been working as a supervisor? And I think it's about 10 years. I trained 2009. So when I first started, I noticed that people were coming to me for supervision from multiple contexts: life coaches, business coaches, people that were working in the private sector, the public sector. And I think that was a reflection of where, certainly in the UK, the market for coaching supervision was. So when I started out as a coach and wanted supervision, there weren't that many coaching supervisors who had only ever worked as coaches available. Almost all of my supervision at the time was from somebody who'd been in a therapeutic setting and was now including coaches in their practice. So as I said, this was, you know, best part of 10 years ago, And as somebody who is genuinely a coach and then a coach supervisor, I haven't, although I was in HR and psychology before that, I haven't been a practicing therapist or business psychologist. I'm absolutely in the coaching frame. And so what I was noticing was that people looking for a coaching supervisor came from a whole variety of contexts. So that was interesting for me, in that actually I was now dealing sort of third hand with contexts that I was personally unfamiliar with. And that was kind of okay, because that's what you can do in coaching. Interestingly, I don't know about your experience. Excuse me, I think I'm going to sneeze. Sorry, yes. In the coaching field, people say you don't need to understand the context in order to work. And sometimes it can be a distraction. But what we know is that coaching clients often gravitate to those people who do know their context, because they assume that you're going to have a similar language. There's a sense of rapport and understanding. So this was interesting for me to genuinely, so I mean, I think most of almost exclusively, my coaching assignments are in the private sector, and that's my background. When I moved into supervision, a lot more of the coaches I was working with had a public sector background, a not-for-profit background. So I was definitely working in territory that I had no proper understanding of, which made it different for me. I think what's happened in those 9-10 years is that we have got more coaching supers entering the market, and I can see more differentiation. And indeed now we have internal supervisors, so organizations are investing in supervision skills, so that I mean, we could have a conversation about dual relationships and complexities, but the reality is organizations are investing in their own supervisors. So I think this kind of multiple context thing might change. But when I first put this together, there was a sense of, as a supervisor, one has to have more agility, more flexibility, more openness in the kind of sense of environment in which they work, and either not be distracted by that, or welcome the not knowing and use that as part of the exploring element of supervision. So that's principle 5. Let's go back. Oh, stop share, that would help, and see if that prompts any discussion in you.
Just a question, Michelle, that I have, because in the United States, coach supervision is at least 10 years behind where the UK is, and similar to what you're talking about, I'm experiencing that, and I was thinking about the internal perspective and how do you even start to explain supervision. So I was just curious, since you mentioned the change over the 10 years, is there anything else that you think, from somebody who's been a coach for almost 12 years and is moving into coach supervision in an environment where people don't understand it, is important for me to take a look at?
Yeah, I don't think you can underestimate how little people understand. So even in the UK, I've just literally this afternoon come off a call, and with an organization where they're disappointed with the kind of take up of supervision. And what they were saying is, I don't think people know what to bring. And it's always bothered me that people feel that they have to bring a problem to supervision. And actually they can bring successes as well, or they can bring something that hasn't happened yet but they want to prepare for. So I think, in making that transition, because when we're trained, perhaps we think, well, big picture, actually we can sometimes miss the nuts and bolts. And so what can you bring to supervision? What would be okay? And offering some examples of things that that might prove really useful fodder material for supervision. And particularly if there's group supervision, again, there tends to be assumption, well, I can't turn up unless I've got something that's to bring. And I have a phrase which is, group supervision should be seen as a team sport. So, it helps coaches connect with other coaches and get that sense of belonging and community. And it doesn't matter if you haven't got a particular case to bring, because I'm pretty sure each person would have something to offer whomever is bringing something. So I think it's some real basics, helping people understand what they can bring, what's allowed, what might be slightly outside of the boundary. So, for example, I've had a whole debate with people about, is it okay for people to bring elements of their coaching business into supervision? And that will divide the room. Some people say, no, we're not a consultant, we're not a mentoring service, you're ignoring the client. But I would take a different view that, perhaps if you're anxious about developing your business, you could make all sorts of inappropriate decisions on who you're going to work with and why. And so it's just a different starting point to have a supervision conversation. But not everybody would agree with me in that. So my answer to you, Josette, is really nuts and bolts. Start with the nuts and bolts, help people understand what could be in supervision that they could discuss.
Great. Thank you. That's helpful.
Go ahead, Ines.
Thank you. In your experience, Michelle, what is more accepted with internal coaches, one-on-one supervision or group supervision?
Oh, I think it depends on the culture. So and how supervision is introduced. So the organization I was talking about that I was speaking to earlier on, they started supervision on offering one-to-one, and that seems to be where they feel safe. It's not helped by the fact that a community of coaches is their managing director, which is great from a coaching culture point of view, but sends all sorts of dynamics into group sessions. So for them, starting with one-to-one was sensible, and that's where they feel safe, and we're now encouraging them to be braver. In another organization, they were very I guess they're quite collaborative, and they're quite community of practice oriented. So it's a large consulting organization. So they're used to having a community of practice around different business areas or different products. And for them, it felt much safer to be in a group. And as the group supervisor, that was sometimes cozy club. So I had to work against that. But they then became very exposed in a one-to-one because there was no place to hide. And it felt perhaps a bit more like, well, I think their presumption was that it would be a bit like therapy. So there was a kind of hesitation about what might happen in a rather intimate one-to-one session. So it's about culture, I guess.
Thank you.
Anything else before we move on? I'm conscious we've got about 12 minutes left. Lily, is that right? Good.
I'll just need a couple of minutes to close.
Okay. So systems perspective, from a coaching lens, this was about recognizing the client doesn't work in a vacuum. And of course, this is probably absolute dynamite really for supervision. If I can just get to clicking on my slides here, sorry. Of course, in supervision, what that is the parallel process. And so, that is perhaps the key difference, certainly in training, between what's required of us as a coach, which is just about being aware of the system, and as a supervisor, being acutely aware and almost using the system in service of the client. So I'm just going to pause there. I guess this is a more traditional thought piece around coaching and coaching supervision. Any comments on that difference between just understanding that a system's there versus using the system in service of the client? Okay. So let's move on. So what Blockett says in his 7th principle is very much that when we think about coaching, we tend to think about it as a discrete session as part of a program. And I mean, this was 2006 he was writing, so he was really advocating, you know, do coaching everywhere, do it in the corridor, do it, you know, on the bus, do it anywhere you can find it, because it's just a different kind of conversation where you're empowering the individual to move forward. And I guess I've touched upon this a little bit before, in that for me, it's a bit the same in that there are many opportunities for supervision, but almost kind of turning that on its head. As a supervisor, we have to do more than just supervise. So I think when we move into that lens, yes, you've got the kind of 3 formative, normative, restorative elements, but what I'm finding is that it requires a real breadth of response. So there are times when I am simply a friend. There is that sense of isolation, not quite knowing where they fit, and being that holding space, and perhaps not doing much at all. And there might be times when I am navigating that boundary between, is this a commercial consulting type conversation or is it a supervision conversation? There's also times when it's that sort of more experienced coach / mentor. And I think it is a huge assumption, by the way, that just because you're a supervisor, you're a more experienced coach. I absolutely know that not to be true. I do a lot of supervision of what I would call career transition coaches when they are working with people through redundancy or through closure or something like that. And yes, I've done a little bit of that, but I've probably done tens of hours. They've done thousands. So I learned quickly that, you know, that just because we're in that supervision space doesn't mean to say we are the more experienced coach. And yet sometimes there are times when we will have a skill set or a toolbox to open and to offer. So I think what's important for me about this is the agility with which I move all of these lens. And I think I operate at quite a broad church. I will move to a number of those hats. And what allows that agility is having that inner sense of when what I'm doing could go a step over a boundary. So I'm really careful to I'm really comfortable with these boundaries kind of morphing, and I trust myself and my supervisees to know when actually I'm stepping into a different space, and to know that, you know, actually we need to find an additional resource or support mechanism for them. So whereas it's kind of all the time anywhere, I'm in a way I'm broader, but I'm also much more tentative to make sure that I'm in the right mindset, I'm in the right capacity. So let me just come back to you for a while. Any thoughts on that?
There's a comment from Dominique around parallel process. Dominique, do you want to say something? You're on mute.
No, I was just stating that parallel process is so much at the heart of supervision that it leaves us wordless, maybe, because it's so obvious. It's evident. Yeah. And I didn't quite get what you just said about the hats and agility of between the various postures, various hats. Did I understand right? If I understand that you don't really care about telling your supervisee, this is now I am counseling, now I am so and so, and you lean on your attention of, is it right? Does it feel right to step into that space? Okay, I got it. Thank you.
So for me, there's something that goes right back to the beginning of the relationship and the contracting, and talking about what supervision might look like. And, you know, as I said, I feel I offer a very church and have a very wide scope. And, you know, sometimes I'll signpost, oh, this feels like, you know, I'm moving to mentoring now, or this is just the human in me talking now. But I'm constantly vigilant that I'm not overstepping the mark. Because although I think we can be many things, I don't think we are a panacea.
Thanks.
Okay. Any final comments on the supervision mindset? Because I think we're pretty much there. Let me just see what else was in the deck. Yeah. So this was really a thinking point in terms of if we're thinking about supervision, just a reflective activity. Some of these principles may resonate really closely for you. Some you might have more of a kind of arm's length reaction to. But I guess what I hope that this will leave you with is some reflection on what's so super about you. In that sense, you know, what kind of supervisor are you becoming? And I use that phrase knowingly, in that my sense is that we're always becoming. There's no real destination with this. It's just a journey to, yeah. So maybe a few too many metaphors there. But that's it from me. Thank you very much. Any questions? And I'm happy to take them in the couple of minutes we've got left.
That was great, Michelle. And I just want to do a plug for your book that I just finished over the summer holidays. It was great. Thank you for that. I learned lots today, the focus on coaching versus supervision. Anyone want to have some last minute thoughts before we just make a public announcement? No? Okay. So thanks again, Michelle. Our next call is December 10th. Leanne Lowish on cultivating the willingness to bear discomfort. And don't forget the supervision conference. I think we have about 12 people now lined up in there. So registration is brisk. Hope to see you all there. And anything you want to say as a last minute, Michelle? Will the slides be shared?
A pleasure to be here. And yeah, in terms of the book that you just showed, that's a good primer for organizations or for individuals who have not yet met. It has things about how to prepare, how to choose a supervisor, or how to organize what you bring to supervision. So hopefully a really useful textbook for people.
Yeah, it was great. All right. So if nothing else, thanks so much, and we'll see you December the 10th. Thanks. Nice to see everyone. You want to just stay a couple minutes, Michelle?
Sure. I'm just noticing that I don't know if we managed to respond to all the chats. I'm very happy if there's any questions in there that didn't get answered verbally. I can do an email response if that's helpful.
Okay. Thanks.